Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the subject of capital punishment in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Geisler presents three different views regarding crime punishment and capital punishment. First of all is rehabilitation, which is a view that just says the government should never be involved in any sort of capital punishment, should never take the life of somebody else. Secondly, the idea of reconstruction, probably the other end of the spectrum, that says the death penalty for all major crimes. Notice I put theonomy in here, which is the view that looks at the Old Testament law and says that's the law. We ought to sort of just take that and make that the law of the land. Death penalty for all those death penalty crimes in the Old Testament. Sort of a middle view in that is what we could call the rule of retribution that says, yes, death penalty for some and those very serious crimes, but not necessarily just trying to take the Mosaic law and put it into practice. Now, crime and punishment has an interesting history. Of course, it goes all the way back to earliest recorded history. But there was a lawmaker by the name of Draco of Athens, who was, of course, Athens was under democracy, and so he was voted in to be their leader. And his laws became known as draconian. That's where we get that term from, because his laws were of such a nature that the punishment was pretty much the same for all law. So if you murdered somebody, you were put to death. If you stole something, you were put to death. If you littered, not really, but in other words, anything, the death penalty was for almost any infringement of the law. And people ask, well, shouldn't theft or something be it's because it's a lesser crime, should it have the same punishment? And Draco replied, well, it's worthy of death too. And they said, well, isn't murder much worse? And he says, yes, it is, but that's as bad as we can do. We can't kill you more than that. And so, that's was sort of his justification in it. And so, just the very idea was considered excessive. Now, by contrast, we have recorded, not just in the Bible, but in many other ancient societies, a more balanced approach. And the balanced approach, the way you would describe it, would be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, and so on. And that's not that you necessarily, if somebody did some damage that knocked out a tooth or an eye or a hand, or it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually took that person and chopped his hand off or knocked his tooth out, but rather that the penalty would be in keeping, in proportion to that which had been committed. And so, for example, let's just take an example. To lose a finger versus a hand, one is more serious than the other. And so one would come with a stiffer penalty. And so this is the idea of a balanced proportional response. Now, the argument against capital punishment, first of all, it is claimed that the purpose of judgment is to reform. It's to get the person to act right. And you're not going to get him to do that if you've killed him. So hence, of course, that's the question. Is the purpose of judgment to reform, or is it a penalty? And of course, each side would disagree as to what that purpose of judgment is. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23 is used by those against capital punishment, where God says, do I have any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord God, rather that he should turn from his ways and live? Wouldn't God rather that he turn from his ways, according to Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23? On the other hand, if you read the next verse, verse 24, but when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, commits iniquity, and does according to all the abominations that a wicked man does, will he live? Now, that's not a rhetorical question. Notice he continues, still the rest of verse 24, all his righteous deeds which he has done will not be remembered for his treachery which he has committed, and his sin which he has committed, for then he will die. And the point of the passage, when read in context, is that the purpose of judgment isn't to reform. The purpose of judgment is to penalize. It is a penalty. Now, the second argument states that capital punishment was abolished along with the Mosaic Law. For example, Jesus references the Mosaic Law when he says, "You've heard that the angels were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. He goes on to say in verse 39, "But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also." And so that brings up the question, did Jesus overcome capital punishment? Did he overturn that? And there's a sense in which, right here, there's a sense in which he did. But we're going to come back and look at that sense. The third argument against capital punishment is that the Mosaic capital punishment is not practiced today for many crimes. I suppose unless you're a Reconstructionist, maybe they would want to do that. But for example, most people who argue for capital punishment aren't saying that that if you break the Sabbath, for example, you go out and pick up sticks or do some gardening on the Sabbath, well, that's it. We're going to put you to death. And so normally most people who are arguing in favor of capital punishment are not arguing to that extent. They're not looking to bring the Mosaic Law in every aspect back into effect. A fourth view is that, or a fourth argument, Jesus did not demand capital punishment in the case of the woman who was taken in adultery. Now, just to be fair, there's some folks that point out that that story, which is recorded in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, that some of the very oldest manuscripts of the New Testament that we have do not contain that. It is found in later manuscripts, but it's a very old tradition. Actually, the oldest tradition I can think of is Papias, who was one of the apostolic fathers, who says, yes, the story did come from John, whether he doesn't necessarily say it's found in John chapter 8, but the story indeed came from the Apostle John, and it really did happen. So I'm going to treat it, even for the sake of argument, I'm going to treat it as though it is a part of the biblical text and that it is a real situation. And it certainly sounds like Jesus, who, you remember the story, a woman was brought to him who had been captured, been involved in adultery. They caught her in the very act. Of course, everybody wonders what happened to the man. Why wasn't he there? Maybe he could run faster, or, we just don't know. And his response was not, and they asked him, what does the law say? And the law said to stone him, and he actually asked them, and they said that. But then he said, okay, let the one who's without sin cast the first stone. And nobody would pick up a stone to cast it at her, evidently indicating they realized they were not without sin. Of course, he was without sin, but then after they have left, he says, where are your accusers? And they've all left, and he says, neither do I condemn you. And so he reacted to her with a response of grace. Now, he didn't say, go out and continue your lifestyle. He did say, go and sin no more. He did indicate that was a serious thing that she had done, but he answered with forgiveness. There are other examples also, other biblical examples of leniency. For example, the story of Cain and Abel, in which Cain murders his brother Abel. And then God shows up, and God says, the voice of your brother's blood cries from the ground, indicating a penalty should have been, could have been, and should have been placed upon Cain. And yet God does not kill him. He instead banishes Cain. They didn't have prison system, so you could say he put him in prison, that is, put him in a different place. He banishes Cain, but he does not kill him. There is also the instance of King David, who had not only committed adultery with another man's wife, but then plotted and had that man killed. It made it look like an accident. It was cover up, but it was murder. And David was not killed. Indeed, God eventually forgives him. Psalm chapter 51 is David's prayer of repentance, and God forgives him. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't reap any consequences. I believe he did. His family life after this was just a mess. It was a travesty. But God continued to work in and through David. And so there's an example of leniency. There is also the example of the prayer of Jesus. Remember what he prayed to the Lord as he was upon the cross? He said, Father, forgive them because they do not know what they do. And they knew they were crucifying somebody, but he prays for forgiveness on their behalf. And so that asks the question, should we not only individually, but should we also corporately as a nation, as a society, follow the example of Jesus? Now, this is more of a humanistic but a practical argument. When you make a mistake in the judicial proceedings and you put somebody to death, you cannot come back later on and say, well, okay, we falsely accused you. We didn't realize all the evidence. Now the rest of it's come in. We have found out that we were mistaken. In case of capital punishment, the damage is done. You've already put that person to death. You can't come back and say, oops. There is no room for oops in the case of capital punishment. And so I think that is a serious thing. I think that even if you come away from this argument believing that capital punishment is appropriate, that we ought to take extreme care to make sure that the righteous are not punished. Indeed, I would suggest it is better to forego an instance where you're not absolutely certain of allowing a criminal to escape than to punish the righteous. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 39, another passage that is used to argue against capital punishment. See now that I am he, God says, and there's no God beside me. It is I who put to death and give life. I've wounded, and it is I who heal, and there's no one who can deliver from my hand. And so it's argued God has the right of capital punishment, but we don't. At least that's the way the argument goes. That God can put to death and give life, but we're trying to take the place of God when we seek to do that. However, Deuteronomy is given in the context where capital punishment had been mandated by God, that he had deputized his people. Now, you could argue that was then and this is now, but at least back then, he had deputized his people to exercise his law, including issues of capital punishment. Now, much earlier than the law, going all the way back to the days of Noah, after they had come out of the ark, God said to Noah, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Now notice several things. First of all, the purpose for capital punishment, the reason for capital punishment, and in this case, it's only speaking about capital punishment in the case of murder, where someone has killed somebody, someone has shed man's blood, and the penalty for that was that that person was to be put to death. Now you say, well, wait a second, isn't the one who carries out that penalty, isn't he putting somebody to death? So don't you have to then put that person to death? No, that's not understood here. But rather, God is instituting the idea of government. You see, prior to this, prior to the flood, prior to Noah, we don't necessarily have anything, and I'm not saying they didn't have government, but we don't have anything recorded, at least in the Bible, indicating the idea of government. And yet here we do, and notice after the flood, God has just carried out capital punishment upon nearly everyone. There's Noah and his family that have escaped, but everyone else has died in the flood. And now God is saying, I'm not going to do that every time people sin. I'm not going to come and I'm not going to put them to death, but instead you are. In other words, he is delegating that authority of judgment to mankind. Whoever sheds man's blood, and that's the case in which the capital punishment takes place in this case, it is for murder, and later on I think that's clarified in Exodus and Deuteronomy that it is for premeditated murder, And the term is used, there's a different, it doesn't just say thou shalt not kill. It actually has a term that really does mean murder. Somebody who kills somebody else planned and premeditated and without good reason. Not warfare, not an accident, not part of the government's decision, but what we would call murder. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. And notice the reason why is because man is made in the image of God. That you are saying that human life, man made in the image of God, is so precious that the penalty for killing that image, the penalty for killing someone that has that image, is that their own life is forfeit. It is not pulling down the quality of life and saying life is unimportant. It is raising it up to the very highest standard. Now, Paul in the New Testament speaks about this same sort of issue, and notice it's still under the area of authority and rulership. Romans chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, where Paul says, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it is, that is government, these ones in authority, it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. Notice there's no time to be afraid, not time not to be afraid. For it does not bear the sword. Notice that phrase. It does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Now, I want to close this discussion with noting that there is a place of grace and forgiveness. And our place of grace and forgiveness was at the cross, where Jesus gave the example. We already cited his prayer. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And so he forgives personally, and I think this is the same sort of impact that you have in his Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Whoever kills someone, whoever does something bad, there's a place of judgment. And yet personally, that's governmentally, and that's appropriate, but personally, we are called to a higher standard, a higher ethic, a higher personal ethic, where it's not just about the government and what the government does in justice, but we are all also called to forgive as we have been forgiven. And that's what Jesus says also in the Sermon on the Mount, but in chapter 6, when he is teaching people how to pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then Jesus goes on to explain that if we do not forgive others, how is it that we expect to be forgiven ourselves? Here's the principle. It is that forgiven people forgive, because we have been forgiven such a great amount.